So first of all, I think it's useful to start with the definition of what we mean. What is, I like to use the word autocracy.
It's easier to say.
Sorry?
It's easier to say.
It's easier to say than authoritarianism. It's not that different from dictatorship and so on, but I like it because an autocracy, the modern autocracies, some of them are dictatorships, some of them are one-party states, some of them are one guy, some of them are oligarchies. They're a little bit different, but they all fit this definition of autocracy. What is an autocracy? It's a political system where whoever it is that rules, whether it's one person or a group of people, rules without checks and balances. They rule with, they have no independent courts who can challenge them. They don't have rule of law, meaning that the law itself has power and judges seek to conform to the law, but they have rule by law. And that means that whoever is in charge gets to decide what the law is at any given moment. So there's no constitution to refer to. Instead, if the leader wants to change the law or wants to influence the way a court decides something, then he does it. And that's what rule by law is. These are systems where the ruler or rulers control or seek to control the media and public conversation, and they don't tolerate real, authentic dissent or authentic difference. And this is roughly the description of Russia, of China, of Iran. And these are very different systems. Russia is a nationalist. You could describe it as a nationalist power. China is the Chinese Communist Party, runs China. Iran is a theocracy. Venezuela is the ideology is something called Bolivarian socialism. North Korea is its own thing. So these are different kinds of political systems with different ideologies, but they all have this same essential, the same essential characteristics. When we talk about the countries that make the transition from democracy to dictatorship, most of us have in our minds the idea that that is something that happens with violence. Like there's a coup d'etat, there are tanks in the street. There's a colonel who shoots up the chandelier in the presidential palace, and that's what it looks like when democracy fails and turns into autocracy. Actually, in the modern world, over the last 50 years or so, most democracies that have declined have done so at the hands of elected leaders. So somebody is elected democratically. Hugo Chavez, who became the dictator of Venezuela, was democratically elected. Actually, Vladimir Putin, who became the dictator of Russia, was also democratically elected. I mean, the first election was dicey, and the more recent elections were fake. But there was stipulate. But very often it's someone who comes to power with some kind of popular mandate, and who then, once he is in power, then begins to dismantle all of those things that democracies have that autocracies don't. So the rule of law, independent courts, independent media, opposition, legitimate opposition, and rather than ruling, in conversation with people or in conversation with opposition parties, that person then begins to try to capture the state, so to take over regulatory agencies, institutions, again, courts, media, and so on. And that process of state capture is something that we've seen happen in many countries. And that's usually the way that democracies decline. And the problem, of course, for Americans and Europeans and others who imagine in our minds that autocracy and dictatorship involve some kind of military coup, is that when we are experiencing the decline of democracy that's happening on behalf of an elected leader, we often don't see it. For odd reasons, I had some friends from Venezuela. I went there 3 or 4 years ago. I did do, at one point, a lot of work on Venezuela. I looked at how it worked and how democracy had declined there. And one of the interesting things about it was that even some years into the Chavez regime, Chavez was elected president, he immediately began to assault judges, journalists, civil servants, and so on. Even 6, 7 years into the regime, if you had polled Venezuelans and you had said, do you live in a democracy, most of them still said yes. So even as the state was declining, people said, well, we still have elections, or we still have we still have pieces of the system that we recognize. Even as it was declining, it was hard to see. I also watched very closely. I worked a lot in Hungary at one point. I did some research for a book there. And I watched a similar process, a very slow process take place there. This is another place where you had an elected prime minister, very legitimate mandate. Actually, he had a very big mandate the first time he was elected. And he also began this process of slowly taking over institutions. And so I think for Americans, the thing to watch out for is not what you imagine dictatorship looked like. And this is why it is dangerous a little bit to talk about the 1930s, because we all think of Nazis. We think of people in jackboots marching down the street. Actually, the decline of democracy and its replacement with something different might not look like that at all. It might be something very slow. It might involve changes to the way the Department of Agriculture is run. It might be changes in the way that the president and the relationship between the president and Congress. And so what all Americans should be looking for now is those kinds of warning signs. So the warning signs aren't, as I say, it's not like a Nazi movie. It's more like, are the laws being upheld? Are institutions that are supposed to be independent still respected? Are judges, and lawyers and police able to do their jobs without political interference? Those are the things to be watching for over the next few years.
Yeah.